Today, once again, Ukraine successfully flew drones deep into Russian airspace and struck Moscow. And once again, the airports were closed and the people of Russia began to panic. And a lot of people will be talking about those drone strikes today. But there's a more important story. And those drone strikes are just part of that larger story. And that is that something deeper inside of Russia is breaking. And though Putin would like the world to believe that his regime is stable and that Russia is successfully weathering the storm, when you look past the propaganda, you look behind this staged calm, you realize there's a brutal truth, which is that the Putin regime is imploding fiscally, militarily, and structurally. This war is not just bleeding out the Russian army, it's also hollowing out the very state itself, a state that is now having systemic failures. And that's why Putin is turning to, as many dictators before him, the consolidation of power. It's what they always rely on when they hope they can still hang on and still survive. And it's probably not surprising that Vladimir Putin is turning to those whom he trusts. In this case, the FSB, the Security Service of Russia. Keep in mind, he was a former director of the FSB back in the 1990s. And before that, he had served in the KGB, the organization that came before the FSB. And that's why the law that passed the Duma yesterday, the Russian parliament, which just rubber stamps whatever Vladimir Putin asks, is quite important. This new law gives the FSB the right to have its own prisons. That's something that even the military in Russia doesn't have. But why do they want this? Why is this a seismic shift? Well, first, let's look back in history. The last time this happened in Russian history was Stalin with the NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB. He did this during the Great Terror. And the reason then is the same reason as today. It's because he doesn't want the secret police to be reporting to anyone else but to themselves. They are the law. They are creating these prisons not for logistics purposes, but for power. With this, they now can repress people internally and have no one else looking in. They can repress people in cases where they don't believe that other ministries would be able to do it. They don't believe that they can contain the problems that Russia is now facing that are soon coming its direction. But what they're preparing for is the need to be able to arrest many people, including within the police, including within the military, and to make sure that those people have no recourse and no insiders who are their jailers. Like, keep in mind, Vladimir Putin is reverting to what is an old blueprint throughout many dictatorships of history. It's the secret prisons, the elimination of dissent, and ruling through fear. And the fear today in Russia is quite clearly existent. Just look, Roman Starovoyt, who was the minister of transportation, well, he allegedly committed suicide uh, just hours before he was fired by Putin. That is, Putin fired him knowing that he was already dead. Why was that? Well, quite clearly, Putin and regime wants to make clear that nobody is above their direct management. And that actually says a lot because when ministers begin to be killed by the government, or if he did kill himself to avoid interrogation, or when your secret police are now building their parallel legal system, their parallel gulags, and you are now filling up the government with more spies, it's not just authoritarianism. It's a very good sign that your entire system is beginning to collapse. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post, and I've worked with the Democratic opposition to Vladimir Putin for 2 decades. And it's why I built this YouTube channel, is because I really do believe that once people understand who the Putin regime is, what it's up to, and who it works with globally, naturally more people will support Ukraine. Because the Putin regime is a threat not just to Ukraine, and not just to Europe, or not just the US. It is a global threat. So if you want to help me get out this message to more people, please like this video, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below, and consider becoming a channel member. And just one last thing. We have been doing a fundraiser to get more drones to save Ukrainian soldiers' lives. And I thank you very much. We passed 15,000 euros we've raised, which is phenomenal. And we're going to continue fundraising to support the Ukrainian soldiers. So in the first comment below, I've put a PayPal link for those who wish to donate. Thank you. So let's look ahead. The death of Starovoyot was part of something larger. He was part of a massive amount of corruption in the Russian military. In fact, he was being investigated for embezzling about $246 million that were meant for the defense of Kursk, Russia, in case Ukraine attacked. Not only did Ukraine attack, and Russia was found to be totally undefended, Ukraine then invaded and then occupied Kursk, Russia. But that sort of corruption within the military is indicative of the entire Russian military. And that's why they're seeing the disasters they are today. They're seeing the strikes deep inside of Russia. They're seeing the strikes on Moscow. They're seeing the strikes on July 5th on Voronezh at the air base. That air base has Russia's Su-34 bombers. And these are getting attacked by Ukraine on a regular basis. Ukraine, just in the past week, has closed down Belgorod, Kaluga, Moscow, St. Petersburg. Name the city, and Ukrainian drones have been there. The war is now coming home to Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin has no means of stopping it. He doesn't know what to do. And where it gets worse for him is, like many dictators before him, is that he starts to become paranoid. And he starts to make decisions that are becoming increasingly irrational. For instance, just earlier this week, we saw that Konstantin Strukov, one of the Russian oligarchs, a member of Putin's party, the third largest gold producer in Russia, was arrested on his private jet. And now, authorities are seeking to nationalize 100% of his company. These are all bad signs. Ministers killing themselves, allegedly. One of the richest people in the country being arrested and all of his assets nationalized. These are not signs that the Russian economy is doing well. When you look at what's going on in other sections of the Russian economy, it doesn't get much better. Consider this. Russia oil and gas are about 40% of the Russian national budget. Year over year in June, their revenue dropped by 34%. That forced the government to totally rewrite its budget. Putin was forced to triple his projected deficit for 2025. Another contributing factor is that Urals crude, the oil that comes from Russia, is now trading at $52 a barrel. The Kremlin had set a baseline in its budget estimates that it would sell for at least $70. That's a pretty big gap, $18 less. And don't forget, the largest buyers of Russian oil are China and India. Both countries are asking for steep discounts to buy the oil currently. And on top of what's that right now is that the US is looking to put 500% tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil and gas. And in both the case of India as well as China, it looks like they will stop buying Russian oil and gas. That would be extremely destructive for the entire economy of Russia, but especially for the national budget. Now, if you look at the oil companies themselves and how they're doing, Russian oil firms collectively in the first quarter of 2025 lost about $4.5 billion. Rosneft's profits collapsed by 74%. Lukoil's fell by 82%. There's outright losses that have been posted by Gazprom Neft, Rusneft, etc. So in quarter two, oil prices fell another 21%. So if you look across the entire industry, the sector, we realize at this point, it's not profitable. Russia's behemoths in the energy industry, the regime's financial backbone, are bleeding cash. But look at other natural resources. For instance, coal. So coal year on year fell by 35%. Global prices have dropped by 30%, and revenue has crashed by 60%. So just imagine that. There's no longer profit, there's just red ink. And this is not just an energy crisis or a big problem, it's a death spiral for the way that Russia got hard currency. And to give you an idea that this is not just one industry, let's look broader. For instance, look at the real estate industry. Now, the real estate industry is becoming more and more of a disaster as sales are down 13% year on year. But when you look at the sale of new buildings in places like Moscow, they're down 42%. Developers are now panicking and they're beginning to bankrupt themselves. And it's expected that in quarter three, there's going to be a large upsurge of bankruptcies throughout the development industry in Russia. And the reason is simple is that the middle class has simply stopped buying. On the other side of that, investors, Those who are also typically buying real estate or investing in it realize what's coming next and they realize that nothing good's coming. Consumer confidence is completely down the drains. Look at year on year visits to Russia, restaurants in Russia are down 33%. Now, during that same period of time, food costs have increased by 22 to 50%. So, though the propaganda says that the incomes are rising, people aren't eating out and they can't afford to even buy food at home. And Russia's budget is just burning through rubles. The 6 month deficit is 3.7 trillion rubles. That's about $41.6 billion, dollars, 6 times higher than the same period last year. Revenues just grew by 2.8% over 6 months, but spending grew by 20%. So revenues by 2.8, but spending by 20%. Now, what makes that interesting is if you have a current inflation rate that is officially 9.8, well, that means in fact that your revenues were still in the red. Not only are you spending more, your revenues had no value. You were even more in the red when you started. It just gets worse and worse for the Russian economy. So, if you look at another indicator, look what they've done with the National Welfare Fund. That is the fund that pays for all the social things in Russia, including pensions. The Kremlin has spent about $5.9 billion dollars in the first part of 2025. That will surpass the 11 billion dollars that they spent in 2024. Now, what's interesting about that is that Russian economists are projecting that all the funds could be depleted by 2026. That would be a huge loss. That money pays for so many things within Russia. Literally, people are going to be left out with absolutely nothing. And given that the government's already using those monies to prop up state enterprises that have been losing money, it means those enterprises will totally collapse once there's no longer money left for this from this wealth fund to pay for them. Russia, to try to pay for what it has today, is expected to devalue the ruble from its current about 80 ruble to the dollar to 120 to 130 per dollar, just to balance the books. That means that people are going to lose 50% of their money due to devaluation just in the course of the next few months. 50% devaluation. That's a pretty huge loss. It's not something that's easy to survive. And for Vladimir Putin, it gets worse and worse when you look at the banking sector. They lack liquidity, they lack stability, and the banks are heavily dependent on the central bank to intervene, to give them repo loans, so that they don't show the entire population how totally insolvent they really are. They've already put restrictions on how much money you can take out a day because they want to prevent bank runs. Now, interesting enough, Vladimir Putin and his team are very successful in telling the world that things are actually going okay in Russia, which they're not. In fact, as I've mentioned before, one of the most important organizations I think inside Ukraine, outside of the military, is the Center for Strategic Communication and Information Security, STRATCOM. It's headed by Ihor Solovey. And what they do is they're the premier group in the world fighting Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda. And they confirm what I do believe and see, which is that though things are getting worse and worse within Russia, Russian authorities are spending more and more money to try to keep the perception globally and at home that things are okay. So it's very important that we do more. The public understands how bad the situation is in Russia and that they talk about it. Because ultimately, we want people in Russia to understand that their government is destroying their future. And if they want a better future, they need better leaders. Because the Putin regime is destroying not only Ukraine and fighting a war against the world at once, it is also destroying Russia and the Russian people. So Vladimir Putin must be stopped. Thank you for listening. And as always, thank you very much for supporting Ukraine.